Rizal was just visiting the U.S. Visiting different parts of the country, starting from San Francisco and all the way to New York. So it was May 1888 when these two writers sort of shared even the same air and space in New York City, the hub of a modern U.S. empire. The so-called Spanish-American War in 1898 created an important shift in the history of the modern world. An old empire was replaced by a rising power, indicating not only the end of a historical phase represented by European power, but also the coming of a new era led by the United States. As a result of the war, Cuba and the Philippines almost simultaneously achieved their provisional independence from Spain, although they at once became targets of US expansionism. Cubans and Filipinos were both caught between the two empires, thereby the title of my book, Between Empires, and even had similar experiences of colonial injustice. Equally notable is the presence of a transoceanic circuit of ideas that would juxtapose these colonies under the rubric of anti-colonial resistance. Various writers and political actors from the Caribbean and Southeast Asia articulated their own versions of anti-colonialism, representing the broader cultural politics of a trans-Pacific network against both Spain and the United States. So my talk compares briefly the fin de siglo, the late 19th century literature and history of anti-imperialism in Cuba and the Philippines, focusing on perhaps the most prominent national authors of the two contexts, Jose Marti and Jose Rizal. It is easy to recognize the overwhelming commonality in the works of the two writers. While they analyzed the history of failed independence movements in their respective countries, they also attempted to transform the dilemmas of imperial culture into building blocks for national liberation. Grounding my study in this historical political premise, I asked, what similarities and differences can we perceive in their writings? How do they reconcile or combine anti-imperialism and nationalism? How do they deploy literary and political writings to articulate a discourse of protest? And what are the limitations of such discursive practice? What are the implications of their common ideology in the larger historical framework of 19th century Latin America? And lastly, to what extent do they create the conditional possibility for a cross-cultural, trans-oceanic form of alliance against imperial domination? Even at a basic biographical level, we can highlight numerous parallels in their lives. The Mexican philosopher Leopoldo Sea compares their patriotic ideas and, rather hyperbolically, regards Rizal as Marti's, and I quote, twin brother. In fact, the two writers came from different ethnic and cultural backgrounds. Marti was a Creole Spaniard born in the Americas, whereas Rizal was a mestizo, whose family origin included Chinese, Japanese, Spanish, and Indio ancestors. When they were young, they spent several years in the Spanish metropolis and even studied at the same university in different time periods, Central University of Madrid. Both pointed out the problem of importing foreign models and underlined the significance of native elements in order to establish a new republic. The similarity discovered in literature they similarly discovered in literature significant tools to construct a unified national identity vis-à-vis an imperial power. Nonetheless, there were remarkable differences between their perspectives on the notion of independence. Marti's independentista stance accepted neither autonomy nor assimilation as an alternative to Cuba's freedom, while Rizal was more like a reformist, committed to social-political reforms rather than an immediate separation from the Spanish Empire. So that's the idea of propaganda movement that I was talking about earlier. The ambiguity of Rizal's political stance can be understood from at least two viewpoints. On the one hand, as a Filipino intellectual concerned about the future of his country, patria, he definitely desired an independent nationhood. On the other hand, his cultural affiliation with Spain led him to conclude that the best option for his people was a set of reforms, including the country's greater political participation in the Spanish parliament, its judicial representation in the Cortes to expose the colonizers' abuses in public, and more religious involvement in the creation of secular institutions. Both Rizal and Marti played the role of prophet in their countries. Unlike the former, however, the latter was a more radical social revolutionary. Despite their different political positions, both men were killed by the Spaniards within just 19 months of each other. Marti died in the battlefield, while Rizal was accused of inciting a rebellion he did not support and was executed by Spanish authorities. After their death, they became iconic figures of nationalism and anti-imperial resistance in their respective countries. Today, they remain in the epicenter of Cuban and Filipino national hagiography, often regarded as apostles, heroes, prophets, redeemers, and even saints. There is a religious cult in the Philippines that believes in the divinity of Rizal. A Filipino-American scholar, John Blanco, calls these connections between the two lives a series of ghostly parallels. The characterization of their similarities as ghostly is relevant at least three levels. First, despite the overlaps in their life stories, they never actually met face-to-face, to my knowledge. And there is an almost implausible silence about each other in their voluminous writings. Second, their figures can be described as ghostly because even after their untimely death at the end of the 19th century, their political thoughts had considerable influence on the formation of Cuban and Filipino identities throughout the 20th century, till this day. While Fidel Castro famously referred to Marti as the intellectual author of the Moncada attack in 1953, the importance of Rizal's legacy in the 20th century Philippines became evident in Clero Recto's statement in 1962 that, and I quote, "A true Filipino is a Rizalist." Third, we can also see how the two writers continue to haunt Cuba and the Philippines in our present day. They are celebrated everywhere, as I showed in these pictures, in both countries, including street names, parks, buildings, stamps, postcards, and currency. In Manila, Rizal's image silently permeates the public space. His statue that I showed you earlier is placed in Rizal Park, or Luneta Park, marks the focal destination for anyone visiting the city. Close to the monument is kilometer 0, from which all distances in the archipelago are reckoned, making it the geographical center of the country. He is sometimes venerated as the Tagalog Christ by people throughout the archipelago, especially the semi-religious group in Mount Banao. The day he was executed, which was December 30th, is celebrated as a national holiday known as Rizal Day. After his death, there was even talk about changing the country's name to the, and I quote, the Rizaline Republic, with citizens to be named Rizalinos. Today, his picture is hung in every classroom, and all Filipino children are required to take a course on his life and work. If we turn our attention to Cuba, Marti's monument in the Jose Marti Memorial also quietly watches over people's lives in the center of Havana. The statue occupies the Plaza de la Revolución, where Fidel Castro has delivered many of his speeches. The icons of Rizal and Marti are equally immortalized in marble and bronze, and their dazzling ideas remain resonant to this day. Marti's revolutionary ideas have created ideological weapons for generations of Cuba in the country, as well as those in Miami's exile community. In addition, his literary work, especially his poetry, continues to be part of the basic national literary curriculum in Cuban school for Cuban school children living both on and off the island. Considering the two figures' spectral presence and preeminent positions in their respective national pantheons, it becomes clear that the cultural and socio-political realities of Cuba and the Philippines cannot be discussed without referring to these two heroes. Most importantly, the parallels between Marti and Rizal are reflected in their shared ideas of anti-colonialism directed toward Spain and the United States. Through different literary forms, including novels, essays, chronicles, manifestos, they not only criticized the Spanish colonial project, but also foreshadowed the emergence of modern US imperialism. Referring to the old empire, Marti already states in the 1873 essay, "The Spanish Republic in the Face of the Cuban Revolution," and I quote, "Spain has perpetually used the right of oppression, of disgraceful exploitation, and of fierce persecution of Cuba." For his part, Rizal writes his first novel, Norime Tangere, with the purpose of unmasking the hypocrisy of Spanish colonial authority in the Philippines. And I quote, "Because I desire your good health," he's talking to his country, Patria, which is ours, "and because I seek the best treatment for you, I will do with you what the Asians did with their sick, to expose them on the steps of their temple, so that everyone who came to invoke the divinity might perhaps propose a remedy. And to this end, I will strive to reproduce your present condition faithfully, without prejudice." Later, both writers predict the imminent danger of a new American empire, although Marti studies this potential menace more thoroughly than Rizal. He was living in the United States for 15 years. In the essay, The Truth About the United States, published in 1894, Marti alerts Latin America that, and I quote, "In our America, it is necessary to know the truth about the United States," end of quote. He wishes to prevent a situation in which the United States extends its influence over the Caribbean and ultimately over the lands of what he called our America. In the same way, Rizal perceives the rise of US hegemony in 1890, and I quote, "Perhaps the great American Republic, whose interests are found in the Pacific, and who have no interest in the plundering of Africa, may one day think of overseas possessions," end of quote. After contemplating the threat represented by the United States, Rizal settles on the idea that America may indeed attempt to dominate the Philippines once the current phase of the age of European colonialism comes to an end. In diverse ways, therefore, the practice of writing allows both authors to express their ideologies and concerns about the future of Cuba, the Philippines, and Latin America. Specifically, I contend that Marti and Rizal constitute the conceptual framework for what I call an intercolonial alliance against Spain and the United States in the late 19th century. Equally caught between the two empires, Cubans and Filipinos shared certain political ideologies and struggles, and Marti and Rizal were the very engine of these struggles in their respective countries. At the same time, a comparative study of their anti-colonial writings allows us to go beyond the national framework and examine a more transnational as well as a cross-colonial form of protest against imperial domination. My allusion to the intercolonial alliance highlights the possibility of a collective consciousness of resistance that would juxtapose colonized people in the Caribbean and Southeast Asia. Creating a dialogue is one of my goals between Marti and imaginary dialogue. Marti and Rizal serves as an effective way to highlight the importance of such an alliance. This collective consciousness stands out in the history of decolonization in at least two levels. First, the Cuban and Filipino independence movements were liberal in nature, but with a dimension of social protest that spoke to the expansion of modern imperialism in the form of capitalism. Second, coming at the cusp of the 20th century, these movements preceded the contemporary notion of anti-imperial collaboration that would reach its climax with the Bandung Conference of Non-Allied Nations in 1955. In other words, the idea of intercolonial alliance suggests the possibility that a transnational and transoceanic form of anti-imperialism already existed in the 19th century, almost half a century before the emergence of a third world consciousness that is today associated with the idea of the global south. Moreover, my invocation of the intercolonial alliance owes an important debt to Benedict Anderson's Under Three Flags, Anarchism and Anti-Colonial Imagination. In the book, Benedict Anderson discusses the 19th century Filipino nationalism in relation to the global circulation of anarchist inspirations that emerged in the 1870s. Through the history of what he calls an early globalization, Anderson hints at a potential link between 19th century Cuba and the Philippines. According to him, and I quote, the near simultaneity of the last nationalist insurrection in the New World, Cuba, in 1895, and the first in Asia, the Philippines, 1896, is in no way serendipity. He claims that, and I quote, natives of the last important remnants of the fabled Spanish global empire, Cubans as well as Puerto Ricans and Dominicans, and Filipinos did not merely read about each other, but had crucial personal connections and up to a point coordinated their actions, the first time in world history that such transglobal coordination became possible. While Anderson is primarily interested in the influence of European anarchism, I want to focus on the collective anti-colonial resistance based on the Caribbean and Southeast Asia. The nature of this alliance needs to be examined on its own terms within the context of its political agenda instead of viewing through a European lens. From this perspective, my analysis of the intercolonial alliance also invites a critique of the Eurocentrism that prevailed during most of the 19th century. With regard to this cross-colonial relationship, it is also important to note that the history of coalition between Cuba and the Philippines points to a particular geographical terrain that goes across the Pacific. That is, my study reveals the cultural politics of the Trans-Pacific Circuit that involves Latin America, Caribbean, and Asia. The field of Trans-Pacific studies that seeks to examine the literary and cultural relations between the two regions has only begun to attract critics' serious attention in recent years. An increasing number of studies in Asia in relation to Latin American politics and economy has been accompanied by a growing interest in historical, literary, and cultural connections between these two distant regions. While the transatlantic studies and connections between Europe and Latin America have been examined by scholars for many years, the analysis of a trans-Pacific relations is still considered to be a relatively new subject. I believe that my that these trans-Pacific studies and transatlantic studies can supplement each other to provide a more thorough framework for the history of the world and the field of post-colonial studies. So my study aims to contribute to these ongoing conversations regarding the dynamic and interactive relations between Latin America and Asia. And I'm going to finish with some concluding remarks. It has often been claimed that in one of his well-known poems, Versos Sencillos, Simple Verses, Marti prophesied his own death, and I quote, "Don't put me in the darkness. To die like a traitor, I am good, and as a good man, I shall die facing the sun." End of quote. He was killed on the battlefield in Dos Rios in 1895, participating in his first skirmish against the Spanish troops. It was a suicidal attempt because the Cuban leader had never participated in combat before, nor had he been properly trained as a soldier. Today, many describe Marti's death as a deliberate act of martyrdom. On the other hand, in the Pacific, an interesting historical coincidence once again becomes apparent in the final moment of Rizal's life. When Andres Bonifacio and his revolutionary society, Katipunan, began an armed conflict against Spain in 1896, the colonial authority quickly arrested Rizal with the assumption that he was somehow linked with the revolt, despite his explicit denunciation of it. Rizal was convicted after a mock trial and imprisoned in Fort Santiago, where he wrote his famous poem known as Último Adiós, Last Farewell. On the day of the execution, Rizal requested to face the firing squad because he refused to be considered a traitor, but his appeal was denied by the military commander. However, while under fire, Rizal mustered the last bit of his strength in his body to turn toward the firing squad. As if to echo Marti's above-mentioned poem, Rizal also ended his life facing the sun. A Cuban-American scholar, Alfred Lopez, argues that Marti has been transformed into, and I quote, a repeating idol, end of quote, referring to the illusion of a central icon. Considering the multiple representations and readings of both Marti and Rizal that we see today, there is neither a single Marti nor a Rizal that we can turn to as the national symbol. However, if we return to their own writings, we notice that perhaps they already knew in their own time that they would eventually become repeating idols. In his letter to Manuel Mercado, written the day before his death, Marti said, and I quote, "I know how to disappear, but my thoughts would not disappear, nor would my obscurity make me bitter." End of quote. Rizal, on the other hand, expressed his farewell in his last poem, Last Farewell, on the eve of his execution, and I quote, "I am to die when I see the heavens go vivid, announcing the day at last behind the dead night. If you need color to stain the dawn with, let's spill my blood, scatter in good hour, and drench in its gold one beam of the newborn light." End of quote. Both heroes were certainly correct in their predictions, as they describe in their respective poems the thoughts that inspired independence and the blood that galvanized a nation will forever shape the future of Cuba, the Philippines, and the rest of the world. Thank you for your attention.